ES Audio.
From the Evening Standard in London, I'm Mark Blunden, and this is The Leader. London's original one-day travel card, made of paper, was once the affordable ticket unlocking the capital for the masses. But now, Mayor Sadiq Khan's looking at scrapping it after some 40 years' service. Amid financial pressures, Khan's looking to ditch the all-you-can-travel physical paper and magnetic strip tickets as tube, bus and rail passengers move to contactless. But there are concerns that losing the iconic transport pass could see commuters suffering even more financial misery, with 60% fare rises even forecast on some routes where the travel card's a rail card add-on. But under plans currently being consulted upon, paper tickets would no longer be accepted at stations, with even tourists from outside the capital expected to use contactless or Oyster cards going forward. It's all part of TfL's post-COVID deal with the government to try and raise up to £1 billion extra every year after being bailed out during the pandemic. But there's a twist, because the Freedom of Information response has revealed travel card use is actually rocketing. So do we need to move with the times, or is TfL riding roughshod over one of London's few remaining non-digital services? The Leader podcast is joined by Dr James Fowler, a lecturer in strategy at the University of Essex Business School and author of Strategy and Managed Decline, London Transport 1948 to 87. Dr Fowler, in 2023, who still uses a paper travel card?
There's a lot of parallels here with the issue that banks have over checkbooks. What you have is a minority of people, you could call them digital refuseniks perhaps, or people who are just perhaps uncomfortable maybe with data, the data gathering that electronic forms of payment allow organisations to do. And my estimation is the people who are still using them, partly out of habit, partly because they're not so comfortable with electronic means, essentially are very similar, I suspect, as a demographic to people who still maintain checkbooks and so on in the other financial areas.
In your book research, what did you learn about why the travel card was introduced in the early 80s?
It's a very interesting story. To summarise, basically what happens is that Livingston and the GLC cut fares across London by about a third. That's challenged legally and declared to be illegal. Fares then rise by 100%. That then is felt to be excessive, and then finally they're cut again by another 25%, and that all happens in the space of about 12 to 18 months. So there's this sort of crazy roller coaster ride, which has enormous effects on ridership, because people literally just don't really understand anymore what it is they're paying for, or why the fares are shifting around. So I see the travel card, or the introduction of the travel card, as a kind of a response to that. Obviously the concept of buying a ticket and travelling anywhere on the system has sort of antecedents that goes all the way back to flat fares in the early part of the 20th century. But there's this kind of very short-term turbulence that leads to the arrival of the travel card. And I think we're almost 40 years on, aren't we? We're coming up for the anniversary. 22nd of May 83, I think, is when the first sort of slightly primitive form of travel card, it doesn't do everything that a modern travel card does, appears in spring 83.
And was it all fairly straightforward getting that through in policy terms?
Yes, I think it was, because it in a sense it answered everybody's questions. I think it's probably or addressed everybody's needs, I think, will probably be a better way of putting it. So I think one of the great successes of a travel card is that it deals with competition from the car, or it deals with a certain form of competition from the car. So if we step back from this a moment and think about what makes car travel so attractive, it's that if you own a car and you own a set of car keys, that set of car keys is a kind of universal access point. You just get in your car, you start it up, and you have access to the entire road system of the UK. And one of the problems with public transport travel up until the inception of travel cards is you had to buy an individual ticket for every individual journey, and you couldn't just step off a train and onto a bus or all this sort of thing where your ticket literally just took you from A to B by one mode and nothing more. But a good way of looking at a travel card is it's a set of car keys that opens a system to you as a whole. So I think the attractions of that, I think, are self-evident, I think, to all the stakeholders who are involved in LT at that time.
How much travel would you pounds and pence buy in the new zones back in the early 80s?
Off the top of my head, I think it started as two zones which were called City and West End, which were much, much smaller than the entire system then, or certainly than it is now. And I think it basically gave you 10p access to one of those zones, or 20p would get you into both zones. But I think roughly City and West End put together were roughly zone 1 and maybe a little bit of zone 2. That's roughly what it bought you.
And TfL are in financial trouble post-COVID. How would ditching the Travelcard look to boost their coffers?
They're in a pretty difficult situation, and I can run through what I think the challenges essentially are in financial terms. So, I mean, the first one is the one you've alluded to. I mean, I think it's awkward, I suppose, to talk about a permanent loss of ridership, but we're looking at, I think, a very long-term loss of ridership, a structural damage, if you will, that has been done to the pattern of ridership of public transport in London because of COVID and lockdown. And not only is that a sort of an absolute loss, it's also a change to the pattern in which people use the system. And that's very important in terms of rolling stock deployment, timings, and so on and so forth. So there's dealing with that, there's understanding that. And moving on from it. The next issue really is, I think they've got it is linked to politics. So TfL was very lucky, I think, in the first 16 years broadly of its existence, in that broadly, and it is only broadly, the mayoralty and the national government were cut broadly of the same cloth. But since 2016, that hasn't been so, and that has led, I think, to quite significant political frictions, which, whilst not totally absent in the other years, were less so. I think it's also interesting that a former mayor of London became the Prime Minister, and that, of course, the Mayor of London is, in a sense, a kind of a CEO of TfL at the same time. That's quite an interesting dual role that they hold. And I think that's meant that the political relationship has been a lot more thorny in the past 5 to 10 years than it was in the first 15. The last thing I think that relates to this is that in a kind of national context, there is no money. And what's more, events around HS2 and indeed Crossrail, I think, have really done quite significant reputational damage to what I'm just going to call mega projects.
Let's go to the ads coming up. What the future holds for paper-powered public transport. Why not hit rate and follow in the meantime? Welcome back. Dr Fowler, in this new digital world, is there a place for a paper and magnet ticket?
I don't think we're ever going to be able to get to a cashless society, much as large organisations would like that for all sorts of reasons of administrative efficiency and, for that matter, data gathering about the consumption habits of their customers and so on. So I suppose what I see is that they want to reduce it as far as is realistically feasible, but I think you can't have a public transport system for a city of probably 8 to 10 million people where there is no way for people, a minority of people within that population who perhaps don't have access to electronic forms of payment and movement to access the system. That just isn't that isn't realistic. That there's probably legal safeguards, I suspect, that might kick in to prevent that happening. So I think I would guess this is a kind of reduction exercise rather than banning travel cards altogether.
What world cities have really got it right in terms of travel card cost and zone reach?
You've got some real outliers actually out there, Mark, which are interesting. Probably in Estonia is probably the one that jumps to mind quickly, where for citizens there of the city, you can travel for free. So I think in a funny sense, that's this kind of concept of a limitless access to a system taken to its logical extreme. You'll find that in most international cities, Paris, Berlin, so on and so forth, Tokyo, that they have similar systems, to London's in terms of travel cards and so on, but they are significantly cheaper. And that's simply because the municipality or the national government intervene, or there are specific property taxes that are directed towards public transport, which just allow those systems to offer, should we say, a more socialized and accessible transport system to.
Finally, we spoke about the economic damage from COVID. How much were London Transport's finances impacted by war damage from the Blitz?
I think there was a certain amount of war damage that was made good, but I think there's a couple of things that strangle the system really in those years. Firstly is the rise of the car. And the car is really a completely unique challenge, a bit like working from home, but in a slightly different form. Because the car, although obviously it is a mode of transportation, it's also a consumer good. It's like you're having a television, having a fridge, having a foreign holiday. It's prestigious, and it's a positional good, I think, really as much as a utility good. And transport systems in those days didn't really understand how to get to grips with that. So what London Transport tried to do is promote itself and say, oh, look, traveling by London Transport is far more efficient than being in your car, all right, which is true. You can carry more people in a bus and so on, but you can't construe a transport debate just in terms of efficiency. Journeys are about ambient factors as well. So they didn't really understand how to compete with the car, because the car had this sort of consumerist ethos that came with it as well. So it didn't really understand the nature of its opponent, I think, is probably what went wrong for it in the 60s and 70s.
There's much more news and features in the Evening Standard newspaper and online at standard.co.uk. That's The Leader. We're back on Thursday at 4 p.m.